how can we rebuild the embedded tweet and go from this, where we're waiting for iframes to load in, to this, where it's immediate? Let's find out. I'm a huge fan of Twitter, and I use it all the time to find things that inspire me, connect with other people in my industry, and just have a good laugh. And I wanted to create a page on my website that allows me to save off some of my favorite tweets. Also, the completed project and the source code for this video will be linked in the description below. First, let me talk about how most people embed their tweets. So if I found a tweet that I like, and I click on the dropdown in the top right, there is an option to embed a tweet. And this is gonna pull up a snippet of code that you can copy and paste in on your website that has some markup and a script to connect with Twitter. Now, if you're using React, you might use a popular library like React Twitter Embed, which is gonna bundle all this together in an NPM package for you. And what that does is puts an iframe on your page, so allowing you to inject some HTML from another site, and also handles setting up that script for you. So that's what I'm using here. And you'll see that I have quite a few tweets on this page, but when I refresh the page, you'll notice that it's really, really slow to load these iframes. And I started looking at this and I thought, how can I improve this? And I wanted to try out using the Twitter API directly, gathering that information about those tweets, and then statically generating my page so that it's much, much faster. So in today's video, we're going to be using Tailwind CSS to handle the styling and markup of our tweets that we're going to embed. So the first step I took was going to play.tailwindcss.com and starting to put together what the embed would look like. So using their online editor makes it really easy to just quickly throw together some HTML and some class names that will allow you to really quickly iterate and change things and see them appear live right on the right. So I pulled some SVGs in here, I pulled in some text, and I was able to get this tweet looking pretty similar, but a little bit more streamlined for what I wanted to do. And I'll share a link to this embedded play.tailwindcss link in the description. Next, I went over to the Twitter developer documentation and started to look at what it would take to use the new V2 API for Twitter. So there's a few prerequisites here. You need to have a developer account, you need to have a project, as well as an app. And once you have these set up, you get access to an API token. Now that API token will allow you to make requests securely and authorized to the Twitter API. For example, the API endpoint that we care about is for fetching multiple tweets. So we can use this sample curl request, throw in our authorization token, and then check out an example response for what this would look like to understand the data that we're going to be working with in our application to display the different tweets. I'll also include a link to the API reference for this endpoint because there's a lot of helpful information here on specifically what you want to include from this request, whether that's information about attachments or reference tweets, hashtags, @mentions, all that stuff you can configure here by what you send as query parameters to this endpoint. Next, let's jump into the code, and I'll just start at the top of this file, which is a new file called twitter.js, which I put inside my library folder. And I use the library folder for any code that talks to external services. So you'll see I have this get tweets function that takes in some IDs. Those IDs get joined together as a string that's comma separated to be part of the query parameters that we forward to the request. Now I also have a bunch of different fields here that you can feel free to copy paste directly or customize to your needs. But essentially this allows me to fetch all of the different information that I need to do a normal text tweet, a media tweet, reference other authors, do a quote tweet, etc. So we bundle up all of these query parameters, we stringify them, and we include them in the URL to the Twitter API. Now, as we mentioned, we have this Twitter API key that we got after setting up our developer account, and we use that to pass over this bearer token to securely authenticate and authorize our request. To help visualize this response, what I'm going to do is return this JSON that we get back from the Twitter API directly before we do any modification of that data object to get it into a format that's more composable with our front end. So I'm just going to return this JSON directly, and then just to test this out, I spun up a new API route with Next.js that all it does is call this function, pass in some ID for a tweet, and then return this as JSON. So in my localhost 3000, when I access this route, I'm able to see this raw data that we get back from the Twitter API. So I have information about the metrics, when it was created, different attachments, the text. And you see that the way the Twitter API works, it includes things like media or users as separate JavaScript objects. So what I wanted to do was stitch this together into one big object so it was easier for my front end to consume. So for example, when I have attachments and I have media keys, I want to use this media key to fetch the corresponding object down here and stitch them together. So if we go back to our library code and we comment out this return, what you're going to see is that now I have some functions that will clean up and organize this data. So if I refresh this API route, now you see that I have this media object that stitches together these media keys with the rest of the information about the media. Similarly, I had an author ID, and I was able to stitch together the entire information about the author. So I do that over here on the right using these two helper functions that loop over the data and return it in a slightly different format. And then finally down at the bottom, I have some more JavaScript organization where I'm looping over all of the different tweets. I'm using reduce to start with an empty array and then slowly build up a new array of tweets in the new format that includes the author and the reference tweets and the media. So now this array of tweets that I get back is all composed with a single top-level array for a tweet that contains all of that information. Next, I created a new top-level page at pages/tweets.js, and this is the actual route that's in my application when I view my website /tweets. And all I have here is just some formatting to contain the rest of my website, some OG information, a header, a little paragraph, and then you see that I'm looping over an array of tweets and I'm using this tweet component. And we'll talk about that here shortly. But down at the bottom, I use getStaticProps to fetch information about all the different tweets that I want. So getTweets was the function that we just defined in our library. And we use that to pass in an array of different IDs for tweets, fetch back an array of objects that includes all the information we need from the API, and then we forward those to the React component so that we can display them out statically. Next, let's talk about this tweet component. So this started out as just a copy-paste of the play.tailwind CSS output where it was purely static, right? There was no dynamic information being shown. It was hard-coded to one tweet. I needed to update this file to make it so that it took in the object for the tweet that we fetched from the Twitter API and used it to dynamically inject information about the different tweets. So for example, when I scroll down here, you'll notice that I'm using this author URL and I've stitched these URLs together based on the static part of the URL plus the dynamic part from that JavaScript object. And another fun thing that I was able to do with this was use Next.image, which handles all of the responsiveness, the aspect ratio, and image optimization as well, so that it made it really easy to put these high quality images in here directly from the Twitter API. So all of this information now is dynamic. Things like the author URL, the name of the person who tweeted, whether they're verified or not, will show this SVG. And plus, because this is statically generated, we're using Tailwind CSS, specifically Tailwind 2.0. I also have support for dark mode, which is super awesome. If I keep scrolling down, you'll see that I have more SVGs for this content, and SVG for the Twitter icon, the formatted text that's actually displayed in the middle of the tweet, and then two dynamic pieces. If there's media, we want to show these images, and if there is a quote tweet, we're actually going to have this component call itself. This allows you to do quote tweets where you want to have the original tweet nested below the tweet that you're trying to highlight. And I'm able to do this using some recursion, which cleans up this code a little bit. Finally, down at the bottom, I have the time that the tweet was displayed, and I'm using format from date functions to handle all of that formatting for me. And then I also have comma number, which allows me to pass in these raw metrics, and it will intelligently throw in the commas there for me as well. So the combination of all of those in 171 lines of code allows me to create a component with Tailwind CSS and React that will do plain text, images, quote tweets, which has worked pretty well so far. I would love to add support for videos or GIFs or replies, but honestly, this is working pretty well so far for just a few hours worth of work. Hopefully you enjoyed this and learned something new, and maybe you're inspired to go try out the Twitter API yourself and build something similar. The source code for all of this, as well as all the links that I've mentioned, will be in the description. If you'd like to see more things like this, let me know in the comments below. Thank you, everyone.